What's going on, guys? My name is Matt, and recently myself and 6 other tech YouTubers decided to set up a little competition to see who could build the best RTX 3080 PC with a budget of only $1,000. Now, that's not $1,000 on top of the cost of the 3080, but rather $1,000 total. The RTX 3080 itself is a $700 card, meaning we just had $300 to get the rest of the parts, including a CPU, CPU cooler, motherboard, RAM, storage, power supply, and case. In this video, I'm going to tell you about the journey I went on to put this system together and talk about each of the parts and why I picked them. Now, after you watch this video, I would implore you to check out the other PCs in the competition, all of which will be releasing this weekend and will be in a playlist linked below. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about each of the parts in this quote-unquote budget RTX 3080 PC. $300 is a pretty tight budget, but I knew I'd be able to throw together something pretty decent for that price. We were only allowed to purchase items online, so no local deals were allowed. When first doing research, I looked at a ton of different platforms to build on, and I kept coming back to the idea of trying to go for a Ryzen based system. I knew going for an older Intel Xeon would have been a decent option, but because a lot of the benchmarks were gaming related, I knew that I needed a CPU that was going to provide decent single core performance. After looking at what was available and doing some calculations in a spreadsheet, I decided to start looking for a good deal on a Ryzen CPU. One unfortunate thing is that in recent months, Ryzen CPUs have seen a decent spike in price. I was hoping to get a Ryzen 5 CPU, but after seeing the price of 2nd and 3rd gen Ryzen, I knew I would have to go 1st gen. I watched a bunch of eBay listings and eventually bid on and won a listing for a Ryzen 5 1600 for right around $96. This is a little more than I would have liked to spend, but it fit into the budget and was the best I could do at the time. With 6 cores and 12 threads, the Ryzen 5 1600 offers a lot of multi-threaded performance, and the IPC on 1st gen Ryzen isn't half bad either. Another nice thing is the CPU's unlocked, and I did do some minor overclocking, which I'll get into later in the video. Lucky for me, the CPU also came with the original Wraithspire cooler, which is a pretty beefy copper core cooler that offers more than enough cooling headroom, even with the R5 1600 overclocked. For the motherboard, I knew that X370 and X470 boards were going to be way too expensive, and the cheap A320 boards were affordable but don't allow for overclocking. Because of this, I started to look for a B350 or B450 board. After some hunting, I found this ASRock B450M Pro 4 for a little over $50. This is one of the only parts that wasn't purchased on eBay. I actually found it on OfferUp, which many don't know does have a shipping option. This board was originally listed for around $60, but I talked them down to $45 plus shipping, which was a good deal and fit nicely into the budget. The B450M Pro 4 is one of my favorite motherboards of all time, so getting to use it for this competition was awesome. It has 4 DIMM slots, 2 M.2 slots, and a decent VRM setup. The back panel I/O is pretty good, but unfortunately this board didn't come with an I/O shield. One other nice thing about this board is that it's in the micro ATX form factor, which MATX cases are generally more budget friendly when compared to their ATX counterparts. Moving on to RAM, this was an area that wasn't very hard to get something that fit well into the budget. The continuous price drops in DDR4 over the course of the last year or two are one of the main reasons I was able to build on this modern of a platform with this low of a budget. Surprisingly enough, I actually bought RAM new from Amazon. What I got was a 2x8GB kit of Oloy DDR4 RAM at 3200MHz CL16 for a little over $53. Just a few years ago, the same kit would have cost nearly 3 times as much. 16GB is more than enough for gaming, and while I would have preferred to get 3600MHz RAM, this worked great in this build and ran just fine at its rated speed. At this point, between the CPU, CPU cooler, motherboard, and RAM, I had spent about 2/3 of the budget, meaning I only had about $100 left for the storage, case, and power supply. For storage, I went super basic. I just picked up a refurbished 500GB hard drive, buy it now from eBay for a little over $10. The seller guaranteed for the drive to be in good health, and when I got it in, initial tests showed it was working perfectly fine. 500GB was more than enough to fit all the benchmarks and software for this competition, and I think I even could have got away with a 240GB hard drive or SSD. Originally, I was hoping to get an SSD, but just couldn't find a way to fit in the budget. Moving on to the power supply, this is an area where a large amount of focus needed to be placed. Like I said before, the system was meant to house an RTX 3080, which is one of the most power-hungry cards on the market, and cheaping out on this part could have ended very badly. Nvidia recommends a 750 watt power supply, but with a CPU like the 1600, that estimate is a bit overkill. With that being said, I wanted the highest wattage PSU I could afford from a reputable manufacturer. After some hunting, I found a number of units that fit the bill on eBay. Some were buy it now or best offers, so I started submitting offers and eventually had an offer accepted on the 750 watt Silverstone power supply for $25 with about $15 for shipping. Well, this definitely is an older unit. Silverstone is a brand I trust, and this unit ended up working great in the system. One problem though was the fact that it didn't have an 8-pin PCIe power connectors and only had 6-pin PCIe power connectors. This is a problem because the RTX 30 requires two 8-pins. Because of this, I had to pony up a bit more money for two dual 6-pin to single 8-pin adapters. I found these for $8 a piece on eBay and offered to buy two for $7 a piece, free shipping. Luckily, the seller accepted the offer and I got the adapters necessary to run the beast of a GPU that the 3080 is. With the power supply figured out, there was one last item to purchase, which was the case. Generally, Newegg has the cheapest selection of cases, so that's where I headed to start looking. I had a budget of a little under $40, so I knew I needed something pretty cheap. With this being said, I also needed something with good enough airflow to not suffocate the very hot running 3080. After looking at my options for a day or two, I ended up snagging this DIY PC FTW. For the $35 I paid, this was a surprisingly good case. It has a mesh front panel with two included blue LED fans, a side panel window, and overall I think it looks pretty nice for how inexpensive it is. The final part which I had on hand was the RTX 3080. I don't think this card needs much introduction. The 3080 is a $700 graphics card capable of smooth 4K gaming at max settings. This is if it's paired with a powerful enough CPU. With all the parts acquired, it was time to start building the PC. The only major issue I ran into was installing the power supply. There technically was enough room for the unit itself, but not enough room for all the cables. Because of this, I had to drill out a few rivets and remove the drive cage. This made plenty of room for the cables, and the hard drive was moved to the bottom of the case under the excess power supply cables. This power supply was probably designed to go in a much larger case, so the cables were super long, but I was able to clean things up decently well. It also didn't help that from the long PCIe power cables, I connected the 6 to 8-pin adapters, then had to attach those to the dual 8-pin to 12-pin adapter that came with the 3080. With the GPU in, the cables neatened up, and the side panel on, it was time to get ready for benchmarking. Once Windows was installed, I did a few tweaks to remove some background activities, then headed into the BIOS. In the BIOS, I went and set the XMP profile to make sure the RAM was running at its fully rated speeds, and then did a quick and dirty overclock of 3.8 GHz at 1.35 volts. Once this was done, I was ready to download and test all of the benchmarks. Those of us in the competition decided on a few different benchmarks to test our systems. These are all built-in benchmarks, which removes a lot of the variables that could affect the scores. The benchmarks we decided on were Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Rainbow Six Siege, Final Fantasy 15, Time Spy, Blender, and Cinebench. Let's start things off with the gaming benchmarks. We decided to test everything at 1080p, which will allow us to see who really had the least and the highest CPU bottlenecks. Starting off with the Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we tested at 1080p with the highest preset and ray tracing set to ultra. Using the built-in benchmark, my system managed to squeeze out a 93 FPS average. I think this is pretty good, but I'll have to see how it compares to everyone else. Moving on to Rainbow Six at 1080p ultra settings using the Vulkan API, I tested using the built-in benchmark and my system received a 296 FPS average, which is pretty impressive in my opinion. Next up is Final Fantasy 15, which at 1080p, highest quality, the system received a score of 10,019. Next up is Time Spy, which this system provided an overall score of 13,371, and I'll also put the individual CPU and GPU scores on the screen now. Next up are the two more CPU focused benchmarks. Starting with Blender, we use the BMW and FishyCat benchmark, setting the benchmark device to our CPU. Running this benchmark resulted in my system taking 729 seconds. Finally, I tested Cinebench on the system and received a multi-threaded score of 2840 and a single-threaded score of 384. Now, if I had more time, I would have compared these numbers to a system with a much better CPU to see how much of a bottleneck I was creating with the system, but unfortunately, it didn't fit in the time frame. With that being said, if you guys express express interest in a video comparing like this system to one with a 3700X and see how much of a bottleneck it is, then let me know in the comments section below. Also, it's hard for me to judge how good these scores are until I compare them with everyone else's, so let me know how you think I did in the comments below. Again, to check out everyone else's build and scores, check out the playlist linked in the description. Overall, for $300, I think I did a pretty good job, and I'm very excited to see what everyone else pulled off. So yeah guys, I think this wraps this video up. Thank you to everyone else who participated in this competition. I'll have everyone's channels and the playlist linked in the description. If you guys like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And as always, this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.